Sometimes the most powerful moments in history happen when someone says no to what everyone expects them to do. In 1847, deep in the untamed wilderness of Oregon Territory, a young man's refusal to follow orders would set in motion a chain of events that would test every belief he held about duty, honor, and what it truly means to be human. This is the story of how one word, no, spoken in defiance of military command, would lead to a love that defied all boundaries and a rescue that saved more than just one life. The morning mist hung heavy over Fort Vancouver as Captain James Mitchell stood at attention before Colonel Harrison's desk. The year was 1847, and the Oregon Territory was still a wild, dangerous place where survival often meant making impossible choices. James had been stationed at the fort for 2 years, serving as a liaison between the military and the various Native American tribes in the region. At 28, he was known for his fairness, his ability to speak several tribal languages, and his unwavering sense of justice. Colonel Harrison cleared his throat and slid a document across the polished wooden desk. "Mitchell, you're being given a special assignment. The Chinook tribe has offered one of their women as a gesture of peace. Chief Running Bear believes that if you take her as your wife, it will strengthen our alliance with his people." James stared at the papers without touching them. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. He had heard rumors of such arrangements, but never imagined he would be the one chosen for such a duty. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't understand how taking a woman against her will serve any purpose of peace." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Against her will? This is a political arrangement, Mitchell. These people understand such things. The woman is a slave in their tribe anyway. You be giving her a better life. A slave?" James felt his stomach turn. He had witnessed the complex social structures of the native tribes, but the casual way the colonel spoke of human ownership made his blood boil. "Sir, I cannot and will not participate in the ownership of another human being." Colonel Harrison stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "This is not a request, Captain. This is an order. The peace treaty with the Chinook depends on this marriage. Are you refusing a direct command?" James looked out the small window at the Columbia River flowing peacefully beyond the fort walls. He thought of his father back in Virginia, who had raised him to believe that all people were created equal. He thought of the conversations he'd had with various tribal members who had become his friends over the past 2 years. None of them had ever mentioned owning slaves, though he knew some tribes did practice forms of servitude with prisoners of war. "Yes, sir. I am refusing this order." The silence that followed was deafening. Colonel Harrison's face turned red, and James could see the vein pulsing in his temple. "You realize what this means, Mitchell? Court-martial, disgrace, the end of your military career. I understand the consequences, sir, but I cannot compromise my principles, regardless of the cost." What James didn't know was that at that very moment, 15 miles away in a Chinook village, a young woman named Ayanna was preparing for a journey she had not chosen. She knelt by the river, washing clothes and trying not to think about what awaited her. At 22, she had been a captive of the Chinook for 3 years, taken during a raid on her own Nez Perce village when she was just 19. Ayanna was not truly a slave in the way white men understood slavery. Among the Chinook, captives often became part of the family structure, though always with the understanding that they were not born to the tribe. She was treated well enough, but she was never allowed to forget that she didn't belong. Her status was somewhere between servant and family member, valued for her skills in healing and her ability to speak multiple languages, but always watched, always reminded of her place. Chief Running Bear had chosen her for this arrangement not out of cruelty, but because he genuinely believed it would improve her position in life. In his mind, marriage to a white soldier would give her protection and status that she could never achieve in the tribe. He had even spoken to her about it, explaining that this was her chance for a better future. But Ayanna had her own thoughts about her future, and they didn't include being traded like a possession to cement a political alliance. She had been planning her escape for months, carefully observing the patterns of the guards, noting which trails led back toward Nez Perce territory. The announcement of her impending transfer to the fort had simply moved up her timeline. As she folded the last of the clothes, Ayanna made her decision. Tonight, when the moon was dark and the village slept deeply, she would run. She would rather die free in the wilderness than live as property in a white man's house. Back at Fort Vancouver, James found himself confined to quarters while Colonel Harrison decided his fate. His fellow officers avoided him, unsure whether to treat him as a hero or a fool. Some admired his principles. Others thought he was throwing away his career over something that wasn't even his concern. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, James's closest friend at the fort, visited him that evening. "Jim, you know I respect what you're trying to do, but is this really the hill you want to die on? Maybe you could marry the woman and then treat her well, give her freedom gradually." James shook his head. "Tom, you don't understand. The moment I accept her as property, I become part of the system that says human beings can be owned. I can't do it, not even with good intentions. But what about the peace treaty? If the Chinook take offense, people could die. Other soldiers, settlers, maybe even innocent natives." This was the argument that kept James awake at night. He understood the delicate balance of power in the territory. One wrong move could spark conflicts that would cost many lives. But he also understood that compromising his principles now would make it easier to compromise them again later. Where would it end? The next morning brought unexpected news. A Chinook messenger arrived at the fort at dawn, speaking rapidly to the interpreter. The message was simple but alarming. The woman intended for Captain Mitchell had escaped during the night. Chief Running Bear was apologetic, but also concerned. A lone woman in the wilderness faced dangers that could reflect poorly on both the tribe and the fort if she came to harm. Colonel Harrison called James to his office immediately. "Well, Mitchell, it seems your noble stand has resulted in exactly the kind of complication I was hoping to avoid. The woman is missing. The chief is embarrassed, and now we have a diplomatic incident on our hands. Sir, perhaps this is for the best. If she chose to leave, then she obviously didn't want to be part of this arrangement either. For the best." The colonel's voice rose. "Captain, that woman is going to die out there. It's late October. Winter is coming. And she's on foot in country full of bears, wolves, and hostile tribes. When they find her body, do you think Chief Running Bear is going to blame himself or us?" James felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had been so focused on his own moral position that he hadn't fully considered what the woman herself might want or what danger she might face. "Sir, request permission to organize a search party." "Permission denied. I'm not risking more lives on this fool's errand. We'll send word to the chief that will help with the search efforts, but I won't have my men scattered across the wilderness looking for one runaway." But James couldn't let it go. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. He would go after her himself, not as Captain Mitchell following orders, but as a man following his conscience. He gathered supplies quietly, told Lieutenant Bradley that he was taking a personal leave to think about his future, and slipped out of the fort before dawn. James had spent 2 years learning to track and navigate in the Oregon wilderness. He was good at it, but he also knew that Ayanna had a significant head start and would be trying to cover her trail. His only advantages were his horse and his knowledge of the general direction she would likely travel, northeast toward Nez Perce territory. The first day of searching yielded nothing but cold trails and false leads. James found places where someone might have rested, but the tracks were too old or too unclear to be certain. As the sun set on his first day out, he began to understand the magnitude of the task he had undertaken. The Oregon Territory was vast, wild, and unforgiving. Finding one person who didn't want to be found was like searching for a particular snowflake in a blizzard. Meanwhile, Ayanna was struggling with her own challenges. She had been free for 2 days, but freedom was turning out to be more difficult than captivity. She was making good time toward Nez Perce territory, but she was also running low on the food she had managed to take with her. More concerning, she was beginning to see signs that she was not alone in the wilderness. There were tracks that didn't belong to deer or elk, and she had caught glimpses of movement that suggested she was being followed. On her third morning of freedom, Ayanna's worst fears were confirmed. She awoke to find herself surrounded by 3 Blackfoot warriors. The Blackfoot were traditional enemies of both the Chinook and the Nez Perce, and a lone woman would be seen as either a valuable captive or a threat to be eliminated. The warriors spoke among themselves in their own language, but Ayanna understood enough to know they were debating what to do with her. One wanted to take her back to their camp. Another argued that she was more trouble than she was worth. The third, who seemed to be the leader, was asking questions about why she was alone and where she had come from. Ayanna decided her best chance was honesty. In the broken Blackfoot she had learned during her years of captivity, she explained that she was Nez Perce, that she had been held by the Chinook, and that she was trying to return to her own people. She emphasized that she had no value as a captive since she had no family to pay ransom and no tribal connections that would make her worth keeping. The leader seemed intrigued by her story, but the other 2 were growing impatient. One of them made a gesture that Ayanna recognized as a threat. She realized that her fate was about to be decided, and it was unlikely to be in her favor. That was when they heard the horse approaching. James had been following what he hoped was Ayanna's trail for 3 days when he heard voices ahead. He dismounted and crept forward carefully, not knowing what he would find. When he saw the 3 Blackfoot warriors surrounding a young native woman, his heart began to race. He assumed this must be Ayanna, though he had never seen her before. The situation was clearly dangerous. James was outnumbered 3-1. And starting a fight would likely result in the death of the very person he was trying to help. But he also couldn't simply ride away and leave her to whatever fate the warriors had in mind. James made a decision that surprised even himself. He walked into the clearing leading his horse, his hands visible and empty, and called out a greeting in Blackfoot. All 4 people in the clearing turned to stare at him in shock. The Blackfoot leader responded cautiously, asking who James was and what he wanted. James explained in careful, simple Blackfoot that he was a soldier from the fort, that he was looking for a lost woman, and that he meant no harm to anyone. "This woman is our captive now," the leader replied. "She was traveling alone, which makes her our property by right of discovery." James felt his old anger at the concept of human ownership rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I understand your position, but this woman is under the protection of Chief Running Bear of the Chinook. If harm comes to her, it could mean war between your peoples." It was a bluff, but a reasonable one. The Blackfoot had no way of knowing the true circumstances of Ayanna's escape, and the prospect of accidentally starting a war over one captive woman was not appealing. The 3 warriors spoke among themselves again, more urgently this time. James couldn't follow all of their rapid conversation, but he caught words that suggested uncertainty and debate. Finally, the leader turned back to him. You may have the woman, but you must give us something in return. Your horse and your weapons. James's heart sank. His horse and weapons were his means of survival in the wilderness. Without them, both he and Iona would likely die before reaching safety. But refusing meant an immediate fight that he probably couldn't win. I will give you my weapons, but I need the horse to carry the woman to safety. She has been walking for days and cannot make the journey on foot. More debate among the warriors. Finally, a compromise. James could keep his horse, but he must give them his rifle, his pistol, and all his ammunition. He would be allowed to keep his knife and his basic supplies. James agreed, though he knew he was trading his ability to hunt or defend himself for Iona's immediate safety. As he handed over his weapons, he caught the young woman's eye for the first time. She was looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, as if she couldn't quite believe that a white soldier would risk his life for a stranger. The Blackfoot warriors took his weapons and disappeared into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. James was left alone with Iona, neither of them speaking the other's language well, both of them now dependent on each other for survival in a wilderness that was about to become much more dangerous. James gestured toward his horse and said in what little Chinook he knew, "We should go. More danger may come." Iona nodded and approached the horse cautiously. She had ridden before, but not often and never with a white man. As James helped her mount behind him, she spoke her first words to him in broken English. "Why you help me?" James considered the question as he swung up into the saddle in front of her. Why had he helped her? It had started with refusing to own her, but now it had become something more personal. Looking back at her, he tried to find words simple enough for her to understand. Because it was right, he said finally. As they rode away from the clearing, neither James nor Iona realized that their greatest test was still ahead. The encounter with the Blackfoot had cost them precious time and James's means of hunting. Winter was coming fast to the Oregon Territory, and they were still days away from any kind of safety. But they had each other now, two people from different worlds who had found a common cause in the simple belief that freedom was worth fighting for. Their journey together was just beginning, and it would test everything they thought they knew about courage, trust, and what it meant to truly save someone's life. The first day of riding together passed in awkward silence, broken only by necessary communication. James pointed out landmarks and dangers, while Iona shared what little food she had managed to take from the Chinook village. As evening approached, they both realized they faced a fundamental problem. They had no way to hunt for meat, and winter was settling over the mountains with increasing intensity. James found a sheltered spot among some large rocks where they could build a fire without it being visible from a distance. As he gathered wood, Iona surprised him by producing a small collection of medicinal plants and roots she had gathered during her 3 days of travel. She had been trained as a healer in her original Nez Perce village, and even during her captivity, she had continued to learn about the plants and herbs of the region. These help with hunger, she explained in her careful English, showing him several different roots. Not full meal, but keep strength. James watched as she prepared a simple but nourishing broth using the roots and some dried meat she had saved. As they shared the meager meal, they began to learn about each other in halting conversation that mixed English, Chinook, and gestures. Iona learned that James had grown up on a farm in Virginia, that he had joined the army to see the world beyond his father's tobacco fields, and that he had never been married because he had never met a woman who understood his need for adventure. James learned that Ayana had been training to become a medicine woman in her village when the Chinook raid changed everything. That she had a younger brother she hoped was still alive, and that she had never stopped believing she would find her way home. "Your brother," James said as they stared into the fire. "What is his name?" "Takoda," Ayana replied, and James could hear both love and pain in her voice. "Means friend to everyone. He was only 16 when raiders came. I pray Great Spirit keeps him safe." James found himself moved by her faith and her determination to reunite with her family. It reminded him of his own relationship with his younger sister back in Virginia, and he began to understand why Ayana had been willing to risk death in the wilderness rather than accept life as someone else's property. "We will find him," James said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Ayana looked at him across the fire, studying his face in the flickering light. "You speak truth, or just words to make feel better?" "I don't make promises I can't keep," James replied. "But I promise you this. I will help you get home, and if your brother is alive, we will find him." That night, as they took turns keeping watch, both James and Ayana found themselves thinking about the strange turn their lives had taken. A week ago, they had been strangers living in completely different worlds. Now, they were partners in survival, dependent on each other in ways neither had ever experienced. The second day brought new challenges. James's horse began showing signs of lameness, favoring its left front leg in a way that suggested a stone bruise or worse. Without the horse, they would be traveling on foot through increasingly difficult terrain with winter storms threatening daily. Ayana examined the horse's hoof with the same careful attention she gave to her healing plants. "Stone here," she said, pointing to a small sharp rock embedded in the soft part of the hoof. "Must remove, but horse will be tender for days." Working together, they managed to extract the stone and create a makeshift bandage for the horse's hoof using strips torn from James's spare shirt. But it was clear that they would need to travel much more slowly, and time was something they didn't have. "How far to your people?" James asked as they resumed their careful journey northeast. Ayana considered the question, looking at the mountains ahead and calculating distances she had traveled as a child. "In summer, maybe 4 days on foot. Now, with snow coming, maybe 7 or 8 days if horse can walk. More if we must walk too." James felt a cold knot form in his stomach. 7 days with no way to hunt, minimal food supplies, and a lame horse. They would need to find help along the way, or they would both die of starvation before reaching Nez Perce territory. As if sensing his thoughts, Ayana pointed to a distant column of smoke rising from the forest ahead. "Trading post," she said. "French trapper named Baptiste has cabin there. He trades with all tribes, speaks many languages. Maybe he help us." James felt a surge of hope. A trading post meant food, supplies, and possibly fresh horses. But it also meant explaining their situation to a stranger who might have his own ideas about what should be done with an escaped captive and a soldier who had abandoned his post. They reached Baptiste's cabin as the sun was setting, and James could see why the old trapper had chosen this location. The cabin sat at the junction of two well-traveled trails, with good water from a nearby stream, and enough cleared land for a small garden and horse pasture. Smoke rose from the chimney, and James could see several horses grazing in the fenced area behind the cabin. Baptiste Dubois turned out to be a weathered Frenchman in his 60s who had been living in the Oregon wilderness for more than 20 years. He spoke English with a heavy accent, but he also spoke Chinook, Nez Perce, and several other native languages fluently. When James and Ayana approached his cabin, he greeted them with the cautious hospitality of a man who had survived by being both generous and careful. Mon Dieu, he said, taking in their travel-stained appearance, and lame horse. You two have come far, and not easily, I think. James decided that honesty was their best chance. My name is James Mitchell. I'm a soldier from Fort Vancouver. This is Ayanna. She was being held against her will by the Chinook, and I helped her escape. We're trying to reach her people, the Nez Perce. Baptiste raised his eyebrows and looked from James to Ayanna with new interest. Ah, so you are the soldier who refused to take the Chinook woman as wife. Word travels fast in the territory, mon ami. Some say you are fool, others say you are hero. What do you say? James asked. Baptiste laughed and gestured for them to follow him into the cabin. I say you are here and alive, which is more than many predicted. Come, we eat first, then we talk about what comes next. The cabin was warm and filled with the wonderful smell of venison stew. Baptiste had built himself a comfortable life in the wilderness, with shelves of books in French and English, maps of the territory on the walls, and enough supplies to last through the winter. He served them generous portions of stew and fresh bread, and James realized he had not appreciated how hungry they both were. As they ate, Baptiste questioned them about their journey and their plans. He was particularly interested in their encounter with the Blackfoot warriors, and he nodded approvingly when James described giving up his weapons to secure Ayanna's freedom. You did right thing, Baptiste said. Those Blackfoot, they are not cruel people, but they follow their own laws. Show respect for their ways. They show respect for yours. Ayanna had been quiet during most of the conversation, but now she spoke up in fluent French, surprising both men. Baptiste's face lit up as they conversed rapidly in a language James couldn't follow. Finally, Baptiste turned back to James with a broad smile. She tells me you are a man of honor, he said. She says you risked your life for a stranger, gave up your weapons for her safety. She says her people will welcome you as brother if you wish. James felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire or the food. He looked at Ayanna, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I just did what anyone should do, he said. Non. Baptiste shook his head firmly. Most men would not risk court-martial and death to refuse order about woman they never met. Most would not ride into wilderness alone to find escape captive. You are not anyone, mon ami. That night, Baptiste insisted they sleep in his cabin rather than camping outside. He gave them separate sleeping areas, respecting the complicated nature of their relationship. But James could see that the old trapper was playing matchmaker in his mind. As they prepared for sleep, Ayanna approached James with something in her hands. It was a small carved bone pendant on a leather cord. This belongs to my grandmother, she said. She was medicine woman, very powerful. Grandmother always said this would protect from great danger. She held out the pendant toward James. You saved my life. Now I give you protection for your life. James looked at the intricate carving on the bone. It showed a bear and an eagle intertwined, with symbols he didn't recognize carved around the edges. Ayanna, this is too valuable. This belongs in your family. You are family now, she said simply. You choose to help when you could choose to obey orders. You choose danger for yourself to give safety to me. In my people's way, this makes you brother. As James accepted the pendant and felt the smooth warmth of the carved bone, he realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstances. They had become something more, though neither was quite ready to name what that something was. The next morning brought both good news and bad news from Baptiste. The good news was that he could provide them with a fresh horse and enough supplies to reach Nez Perce territory safely. The bad news was that winter storms were moving in faster than expected, and they would need to leave immediately if they hoped to cross the mountain passes before they became impassable. "There is one more thing," Baptiste said as they prepared to leave. "Word has reached me that Colonel Harrison has declared you deserter, mon ami. There is bounty on your head now. Military patrol looks for you." James felt his stomach drop. Desertion was a serious charge, potentially punishable by death. But going back now would mean abandoning Iona, and he couldn't do that. "How much time do we have before the patrols reach this area?" James asked. "Maybe 2 days, maybe 3. But if you reach Nez Perce territory, you are beyond their jurisdiction. Chief Joseph is not friend to American military right now." As they mounted their horses and prepared to continue their journey, James realized that he was burning his bridges behind him. There would be no going back to his old life, no matter what happened. He was committed now to seeing this through to the end. Iona seemed to understand the weight of his sacrifice. As they rode away from Baptiste's cabin, she moved her horse closer to his and spoke quietly. "You give up everything for me," she said. "Your career, your safety, your future. Why?" James considered the question as they rode through the crisp morning air toward the mountains that lay between them and Nez Perce territory. Why had he given up everything for a woman he barely knew? It had started with principle, with his refusal to participate in human ownership. But somewhere along the way, it had become personal, because, he said finally, some things are more important than the life you planned. They rode in comfortable silence for several hours, making good time on the fresh horses Baptiste had provided. The lame horse was recovering, carrying their supplies without difficulty. The weather was holding, though James could see storm clouds building on the horizon. It was near midday when they encountered the obstacle that would test everything they had learned about trusting each other. The trail they were following suddenly dropped away into a steep ravine with a fast-moving river at the bottom. The only way across was a narrow log bridge that looked like it had been built by native travelers and maintained by occasional use. James dismounted and walked to the edge of the bridge, testing its stability. The logs were solid but slippery with frost, and the drop to the river below was at least 30 feet. One mistake would mean death or serious injury. "I go first," Iona said, dismounting from her own horse. "I am lighter, less danger to bridge." "No," James replied immediately. "If something goes wrong, I need to be able to help you. I'll go first with my horse, then come back for you." They argued about it for several minutes, each insisting on taking the greater risk. Finally, Iona made a practical point that ended the discussion. "Your horse trusts you more than mine trusts me," she said. "But my horse trusts me more than you. We each take our own horse across, but we go together." James realized she was right. Trying to lead an unfamiliar horse across a dangerous bridge would be more risky than each of them handling their own mount. They would cross together, side by side, keeping pace with each other. The crossing took nearly 20 minutes of careful, step-by-step progress. The horses sensed the danger and had to be coaxed forward constantly. James found himself holding his breath every time one of the logs creaked under their weight. Halfway across, Iona's horse stumbled slightly, and James reached out instinctively to steady her, nearly losing his own balance in the process. "Thank you," she said quietly, and James could hear both gratitude and something deeper in her voice. When they finally reached the other side, both of them were shaking from the tension and the cold. They remounted quickly and continued up the trail, but James noticed that Iona stayed closer to him now, as if the shared danger had created a new level of trust between them. The afternoon brought the first snow of winter, light at first, but gradually becoming heavier. James began to worry about visibility and the condition of the trail. If they became lost in the mountains during a blizzard, all of Baptiste's supplies wouldn't save them. "How much further to your village?" he asked Diana as they took shelter under a large pine tree to rest the horses. "We are close now," she replied, pointing toward a gap between two peaks ahead. "Through that pass, then down into valley where my people spend winter. Maybe 3 hours if snow not get worse." But the snow was getting worse. By the time they reached the pass, visibility was down to less than 50 yards, and both horses were struggling through snow that was already several inches deep. James began to fear they had made a serious mistake in trying to cross the mountains so late in the season. That's when they heard the sound that made James's blood run cold. The deep, rumbling growl of a large predator somewhere in the white wilderness ahead of them. Ayanna recognized it too, and James saw her face go pale. "Bear," she whispered. "Big one, and hungry before winter sleep." James automatically reached for his rifle before remembering that he had traded his weapons to the Blackfoot warriors. He had only his knife, and a knife would be useless against a full-grown grizzly bear in these conditions. The growl came again, closer this time, and James could hear the heavy footsteps moving through the snow toward them. Their horses were nervous, dancing, and snorting in fear. In a few moments, they would either bolt or freeze, and either reaction could be fatal. That's when Ayanna did something that surprised James completely. She began to sing. Her voice rose clear and strong through the falling snow, a haunting melody in her native language that seemed to blend with the wind and the silence of the mountains. James didn't understand the words, but he could feel the power in them, the ancient connection between human and nature that his own culture had largely forgotten. The bear's footsteps stopped. Ayanna continued singing, her voice never wavering, and slowly she began to dismount from her horse. James wanted to stop her, to pull her back to safety, but something in her manner told him that she knew what she was doing. Still singing, Ayanna walked forward into the swirling snow, her hands empty and visible, her posture respectful but unafraid. James lost sight of her in the white wilderness, but he could still hear her voice, still feel the strange power of her song. Then, the singing stopped, and the silence that followed was the most terrifying sound James had ever heard. He waited, counting his heartbeats, straining to hear any sign of what was happening in the snow ahead. When Ayanna finally emerged from the white curtain of falling snow, she was not alone. Behind her, barely visible but unmistakably massive, was the largest grizzly bear James had ever seen. The bear was following her, not hunting her, walking with the slow, deliberate pace of an animal that was curious rather than aggressive. Ayanna approached James's horse and spoke quietly. "Do not move sudden. Do not look bear in eyes. He is deciding if we are a threat or just travelers passing through his territory." For what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the four of them stood in the falling snow. 2 humans, 2 horses, and 800 pounds of predator that could kill them all without effort. James found himself thinking about his grandmother's stories of Daniel in the lion's den, and he began to understand that some kinds of salvation required faith in things beyond human understanding. Finally, the bear made his decision. With a sound that was almost like a dismissive snort, he turned and disappeared back into the white wilderness, leaving only massive paw prints in the snow to prove he had ever been there. James looked at Ayanna with new respect and wonder. "What did you sing to him?" "Old song my grandmother taught me," she replied, remounting her horse. "Song that asked permission to pass through bear's territory." song that promises we take nothing, harm nothing, leave nothing behind. As they continued down the mountain toward Nez Perce territory, James realized that Ayanna had just saved both their lives using knowledge and skills that no military training could have provided. She had faced down a grizzly bear with nothing but her voice and her faith, and she had won. "You saved us," he said as they rode through the gentler snow in the valley below. "We saved each other," Ayanna corrected. "You gave up weapons for my freedom. I used grandmother's wisdom for our safety. This is how partnerships work." Partnership. James liked the sound of that word. And as they rode through the snow toward the warm lights of the Nez Perce village ahead, he began to realize that what had started as a rescue mission had become something much more profound. He had found not just a purpose, but a partner, and together they had survived challenges that neither could have faced alone. The real test of their partnership, however, was still waiting for them in the village ahead, where Ayanna would discover whether her brother was still alive, and James would learn whether a white soldier could truly find a place among the Nez Perce people. The Nez Perce village appeared through the snow like a vision from a dream. Dozens of teepees arranged in careful patterns, smoke rising from cooking fires, the warm glow of light filtering through hide walls painted with tribal symbols. James had seen native villages before, but never as a guest, never as someone seeking sanctuary rather than representing military authority. As they approached the edge of the village, James felt his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. Everything he had risked, everything he had given up, would be judged in the next few minutes by people who had every reason to distrust white soldiers. The first person to notice them was a young boy tending horses at the village's edge. When he saw Ayanna, his face lit up with recognition and joy. He began shouting in Nez Perce, and within moments, people were emerging from their teepees and running toward them through the snow. James watched in amazement as Ayanna was surrounded by her people, embraced by women who wept with joy, greeted by men who spoke rapidly in their native language. But his attention was focused on one young man who stood apart from the crowd, staring at Ayanna as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Takoda," Ayanna whispered, and then she was running through the snow toward her brother. The reunion between Ayanna and Takoda was one of the most moving things James had ever witnessed. They held each other and wept, speaking rapidly in Nez Perce, laughing and crying at the same time. James found his own eyes filling with tears as he watched them, thinking of his own sister back in Virginia, and how he would feel if she returned to him after 3 years of captivity. But not everyone in the village was celebrating. James noticed several warriors watching him with suspicion and hostility. He was, after all, a white soldier in full uniform, armed with a knife, mounted on a horse. To them, he represented everything they had learned to fear and hate about the American expansion into their territory. One of the warriors, a man in his 40s with scars on his arms and chest that spoke of many battles, approached James directly. He spoke in English, but his words were clipped and cold. "You're a soldier. Why do you bring Ayanna to us? What do you want from our people?" James dismounted from his horse and stood facing the warrior, understanding that this moment would determine his fate and possibly Ayanna's as well. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind during their journey, but now that it was happening, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. "My name is James Mitchell," he said formally. "I'm a soldier, but I'm not here as a soldier. I am here because Ayanna was being held against her will, and I helped her escape so she could return to her family." The warrior's expression didn't change. "You helped her escape from whom?" "From a Chinook who intended to trade her to the American fort as part of a peace agreement." I refused to participate in that trade, and I helped her come home. By now, a crowd had gathered around them, including several older men who were clearly tribal leaders. One of them, a man with silver hair and kind eyes, stepped forward and spoke to Ayana in Nez Perce. She responded at length, gesturing toward James and speaking with obvious emotion. The silver-haired man listened carefully, then turned to James. "I am Chief Red Eagle," he said in excellent English. "Ayana tells me you gave up your weapons to Blackfoot warriors to secure her freedom. She tells me you risked your life to cross bear territory, and that she had to sing the old songs to protect you both. She tells me you've been declared deserter by your army for refusing to own her as slave." James nodded. "All of that is true, Chief Red Eagle. She also tells me," the chief continued with the hint of a smile, "that you promised to help her find her brother, and that you are a man who keeps his promises." James looked over at Takota, who was still standing close to his sister, watching the exchange with intense interest. "I am honored to have been able to help reunite them." Chief Red Eagle spoke again to Ayana, and she responded with what sounded like a passionate speech. James caught a few words he recognized, but mostly he could only judge by the tone of her voice that she was arguing on his behalf. Finally, Chief Red Eagle turned back to James. "Ayana says you're no longer soldier in your heart. She says you chose honor over orders, chose humanity over duty to government that treats people as property. She asks us to give you place among our people if you wish it." James felt his heart racing. The offer was more than he had dared hope for, but it was also more complicated than a simple yes or no. "Chief Red Eagle, I am honored by Ayana's words and by your offer, but I need you to know that accepting me could bring trouble to your people. The American military is looking for me. They could use my presence here as an excuse for conflict." The scarred warrior who had first confronted James spoke up angrily. "See, already he thinks of ways his presence harms us. Already he speaks of military conflict. This is why we cannot trust white men." But Chief Red Eagle held up a hand for silence. "Gray Wolf speaks from experience of many betrayals," he said to James. "But you speak from experience of choosing our side over your own people's orders. Both of you speak truth as you see it." The chief was quiet for several moments, and James could see him weighing the decision carefully. The entire village seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his verdict. James Mitchell, Chief Red Eagle, said finally, "We will give you sanctuary for the winter. When spring comes, you must decide if you wish to stay with us permanently or return to your own people. If you stay, you will face the same dangers we face from the American government. If you leave, you will face court-martial from your army. Choose wisely." It was a fair offer, and James accepted it gratefully. The crowd began to disperse, and several villagers approached him with cautious friendliness. But he noticed that Gray Wolf and some of the other warriors remained suspicious and hostile. Takota approached James and offered his hand in the white man's manner of greeting. "Sister says you are a good man," he said in careful English. "She says you risk everything to help her find family. I am grateful to you." James shook the young man's hand and was struck by how much he resembled Ayana. Both had the same intelligent eyes, the same proud bearing, the same quiet strength. "Your sister is a remarkable woman," James said. "She saved my life as much as I helped save hers." That evening, the village held a feast to celebrate Ayana's return. James found himself seated between Ayana and Chief Red Eagle, treated as an honored guest despite the lingering suspicion of some villagers. The food was delicious, the company was warm, and for the first time in months, James felt like he was truly welcome somewhere. As the evening progressed, James learned more about Nez Perce culture and way of life. He was impressed by their democratic decision-making process, their respect for women's opinions, their sophisticated understanding of the natural world. These were not the savages that military briefings had described, but a complex, civilized people with their own rich traditions and wisdom. Ayana served as translator when the conversation moved beyond James's limited knowledge of Nez Perce, and he found himself watching her with growing admiration. In her own village, surrounded by her people, she seemed to glow with confidence and joy. She was clearly respected as a healer and medicine woman, consulted by both men and women about various ailments and problems. "You are staring," she said to him quietly during a lull in the conversation. James felt his face redden. "I am sorry. I'm just amazed to see you in your element. You're like a completely different person here." "Not different person," Ayana corrected. "Same person, but free to be myself instead of always careful, always watching for danger." James understood exactly what she meant. He had felt the same liberation when he finally decided to refuse Colonel Harrison's order, when he chose to follow his conscience instead of his duty. Freedom, he was learning, was not just about physical liberty, but about the right to be true to yourself. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Ayana asked James to walk with her to the edge of the village. The snow had stopped falling, and the night sky was brilliant with stars that seemed impossibly bright and close in the mountain air. "James," she said as they stood looking up at the constellations, "I need to ask you something important." "What is it? Why did you really refuse to take me as wife? You could have married me and then treated me well, given me freedom gradually. Why did you risk everything by saying no completely?" James considered the question carefully. It was something he had been asking himself throughout their journey, and he still wasn't entirely sure of all the reasons. "Because," he said finally, "I believe that freedom is not something that can be given gradually. Either you are free or you are not. Either you have the right to choose your own path or you don't. There's no middle ground." Ayana nodded thoughtfully. "And now? Now that you know me as person instead of just idea of freedom?" James felt his heart racing as he realized what she was really asking. During their journey together, something had grown between them that went far beyond his original principled stand or her gratitude for rescue. They had become partners, friends, and something more that neither had been willing to name. "Now," James said carefully, "I know that my refusal to own you was the right choice for reasons I never even considered at the time." "What reasons?" "Because you deserve to be loved, not owned. You deserve to choose your own husband based on your feelings, not political necessity. You deserve—" James paused, searching for the right words. "You deserve someone who sees you as an equal partner, not as a prize to be won or a problem to be solved." Ayana was quiet for a long moment, and James worried that he had said too much, revealed feelings that weren't welcome. But when she spoke, her voice was soft and warm. "And if I chose to love someone who had sacrificed everything to ensure I had that choice to make." James felt his breath catch in his throat. "I would say that would be the greatest honor of my life." They stood in the starlight looking at each other, and James realized that everything he had given up, his career, his future, his place in white society, had been worth it to bring them to this moment. He had found something more valuable than any of the things he had lost. But their moment of quiet intimacy was shattered by the sound of horses approaching the village at a gallop. James recognized the sound of military mounts, and his heart sank as he realized that their time of sanctuary was about to be tested. The patrol consisted of 6 soldiers led by Lieutenant Bradley, James's former friend from Fort Vancouver. As they rode into the village clearing, Their presence caused immediate alarm among the Nez Perce. Warriors emerged from their teepees with weapons ready, and women gathered children behind them. Lieutenant Bradley dismounted and called out in a voice that carried across the entire village. By order of Colonel Harrison, I am here to arrest Captain James Mitchell for desertion and to recover stolen Army property. James felt anger surge through him at the phrase stolen Army property, but he forced himself to remain calm. He stepped forward into the light of the central fire, making himself clearly visible. "Hello, Tom," he said quietly. "I see you drew the short straw for this assignment." Lieutenant Bradley looked uncomfortable, but his duty was clear. "Jim, you need to come back with us. The colonel is willing to consider leniency if you return voluntarily and explain your actions. And if I don't return voluntarily, then I have orders to arrest you by force and to take the Indian woman back to the Chinook as agreed in the original treaty." The words hung in the cold air like a challenge. James could feel the tension building around him as the Nez Perce warriors moved closer, their hands on their weapons. Chief Red Eagle stepped forward, his expression grave but calm. "Lieutenant," the chief said in his careful English, "this man is guest in our village. The woman is member of our tribe. Return to her family. We do not recognize your authority here." "Chief Red Eagle," Lieutenant Bradley replied formally, "I respect your position, but this is a military matter. Captain Mitchell is a deserter, and the woman was part of a legal treaty agreement between the United States government and the Chinook tribe." "Legal?" Ayanna stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "Legal to trade human being like horse or blanket. Legal to give woman to man she never met, never chose? What law makes person into property?" James could see that the situation was escalating rapidly toward violence. 6 soldiers against an entire village of warriors would be a massacre, but it would also bring military retaliation that could destroy the Nez Perce. He had to find a way to defuse the confrontation. "Tom," he said, stepping between the two groups, "let me propose something. I'll come back with you willingly, but only if you leave Ayanna alone. She's free, she's with her family, and she's not going back to being anyone's property." "Jim, I can't negotiate the terms of my orders." "Then let me speak to the colonel myself. I'll face court-martial. I'll accept whatever punishment they decide, but I won't let Ayanna be dragged back into captivity." Lieutenant Bradley looked torn between duty and friendship. James could see him struggling with the impossible position he had been put in. Finally, he made a decision that surprised everyone. "Jim, the colonel gave me discretionary authority to handle this situation as I saw fit, as long as I brought you back. If I report that the Indian woman has returned to her own people, and that pursuing her would require a military action that could destabilize the entire region." James felt a surge of gratitude toward his old friend. Tom was giving him a way out that would save Ayanna while still allowing James to face the consequences of his choices. But before James could accept the offer, Grey Wolf stepped forward with several other warriors, their weapons clearly visible. "No white soldier leaves this village," he said in heavily accented English. "They come with guns to take our people. They do not leave to bring more guns." The confrontation James had been trying to avoid was happening anyway. The Nez Perce warriors were prepared to fight. The soldiers were outnumbered but well-armed, and everyone was one wrong word away from a battle that would end in tragedy for all sides. That's when Ayanna did something that shocked everyone present. She walked directly into the space between the two groups and began to sing the same song she had sung to the bear in the mountains. Her voice rose clear and strong in the cold night air, and James watched as both soldiers and warriors stopped their aggressive posturing to listen. It was the same power he had witnessed with the grizzly bear, the same ancient connection between human voice and something deeper than politics or military orders. When her song ended, Ayana spoke in a voice that carried to everyone present, switching between English and Nez Perce to make sure everyone understood. "I was captive for 3 years," she said. 3 years of being owned, of being traded like object, of being told my choices did not matter. James Mitchell gave me back my freedom, not because he wanted something from me, but because he believed freedom cannot be owned. She turned to face the soldiers. "You come here to take me back to be owned again, to be given to man like gift or payment. You come to punish man who chose to honor Great Spirit's law that all people are born free." Then she turned to face Gray Wolf and the Nez Perce warriors. "You want to fight to protect me, and I am grateful. But fighting will bring more soldiers, more death, more reasons for white government to take our lands and scatter our people." Finally, she looked directly at James. "And you want to sacrifice yourself to protect me and my people from consequences of your honor. But your sacrifice will not change hearts of men who think people can be owned." James realized that Ayana was about to propose something that none of them had considered, and he felt both anticipation and fear about what she might say next. "There is another way," she continued, "way that honors freedom for all people, that shows soldiers and chiefs and government that some choices are bigger than law or orders or treaties." She walked over to James and took his hand, looking into his eyes with an expression that was both tender and determined. "James Mitchell, you refused to own me as slave wife. You chose to see me as human being deserving of freedom and choice. Now I choose to love you as free woman making free choice. Will you marry me not because Colonel orders it, not because treaty requires it, but because two free people choose to share their lives?" The silence that followed was profound. James stared at Ayana, hardly believing what he was hearing. She was proposing marriage, but marriage as equals, as partners who had chosen each other freely. "Ayana," he said softly, "are you sure? Marriage to me means you can never fully return to your old life. It means facing whatever consequences come from my choices." "Marriage to you," she replied, "means we face those consequences together as equal partners. It means we prove that love chosen freely is stronger than law imposed by force." James looked around at the faces surrounding them. Lieutenant Bradley looked stunned, but also moved by what he was witnessing. Chief Red Eagle was nodding approvingly, as if he understood exactly what Ayana was trying to accomplish. Even Gray Wolf had lowered his weapon and was watching with intense interest. "Yes," James said finally. "Yes, I will marry you, Ayana. Not because anyone ordered it, not because treaties require it, but because I love you and choose to share my life with you." The transformation in the mood of the village was immediate and remarkable. What had been building toward violence suddenly became a celebration. Chief Red Eagle stepped forward and announced that he would perform the marriage ceremony immediately, according to Nez Perce tradition. Lieutenant Bradley found himself in an impossible position. He had come to arrest a deserter and recover stolen property, but instead he was witnessing a love story that challenged every assumption his orders were based on. Finally, he made a decision that would change his own life as much as James's. "Jim," he said quietly, "I'm going to report back to the colonel that you are not found, that the Indian woman has disappeared, and that pursuing either of you further would require military resources that are needed elsewhere." James clasped his old friend's shoulder gratefully. Tom, thank you. But what about your career? Lying in an official report. Maybe, Lieutenant Bradley said with a slight smile. It's time some of us started putting conscience ahead of orders too. The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything James had ever experienced. It took place under the stars, with the entire village as witnesses, combining Nez Perce traditions with Christian elements that Ayanna had learned from missionaries years earlier. They exchanged vows in both English and Nez Perce, promising to be partners in all things, to face danger together, and to choose love over fear in all the decisions they would make. When Chief Red Eagle pronounced them husband and wife, James felt as if his entire life had led to this moment. Everything he had given up, every sacrifice he had made, every risk he had taken had been preparation for finding this woman and this love. As they kissed under the mountain stars, surrounded by people who had accepted them both as family, James realized that he had found something more valuable than military rank or social position or financial security. He had found a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that grows from choosing each other freely. The soldiers left the next morning, carrying Lieutenant Bradley's report that would officially close the case of the deserter and the escaped captive. James and Ayanna stood together watching them go, knowing that they were finally free to build the life they had chosen together. Do you have regrets? Ayanna asked as the patrol disappeared into the forest. James thought about his old life, his abandoned career, the comfortable future he had given up. Then he looked at his new wife, at the village that had become his home, at the mountains that surrounded their valley like protective walls. Only one, he said, that it took me so long to understand that real honor means choosing what's right over what's expected. Ayanna smiled and took his hand. Come, she said, let me show you the place by the river where we will build our home. Let me teach you about the plants that heal and the songs that protect. Let me share with you all the wisdom my grandmother gave me. As they walked together toward their future, James realized that what had started as a refusal to own a slave had become the greatest love story of his life. He had said no to an order, and in doing so, had said yes to everything that truly mattered. Behind them, the village continued its daily life, and ahead of them stretched years of partnership, adventure, and the deep satisfaction that comes from living according to your deepest principles. They had each saved the other from a kind of captivity, and together they had found freedom that was worth more than anything they had given up to achieve it. In the months and years that followed, their story would be told and retold around campfires and in military barracks, becoming a legend that inspired others to choose conscience over convenience, love over law, and freedom over fear. But for James and Ayanna, the real story was just beginning, written day by day in the choices they made as equal partners in a life they had chosen together.